Good morning.
Good morning. Today we are talking about forgiveness.
Hey everyone, welcome to XYZ Storytellers, a platform started by three people across generations X, Y, and Z, engaging in conversations in the spirit of increased empathy and understanding.
Hi, I'm Erin, the millennial traveler and author. I'm an empath with a drive for connecting to others. I enjoy singing in the car, eating pints of ice cream, and hanging out with my cat, Gimbal.
Hey, I'm Rich, the gray-beard Gen Xer with 30 years in conference rooms or airplanes around the globe. I've also been a Little League coach and a family bus driver. This podcast is a way for me to have the types of conversations that just don't happen enough in my day-to-day life.
And me, I'm Lily. I've always been very opinionated and I speak passionately about things no matter who I might be with at the time. I'm here to share my thoughts and get the perspectives of two other generations so I can grow and expand my understanding of the world around me.
With XYZ Storytellers, our conversations aren't meant to be political, social, or even related to current events. We are just recording authentic conversations on a variety of topics, hoping they will resonate in some small way. Thanks for listening.
Forgiveness. It's a very personal topic for everybody. I think it's a term that is thrown about. And I think there's a difference between forgiving intellectually or in your mind and forgiving in your heart. So that's my initial thoughts.
I appreciate that. Because I think are you meaning like the notion behind forgiving someone in your own mind versus actually verbalizing it?
Well, maybe to a certain extent, but I think the idea of saying I forgive you, saying and meaning it intellectually, but yet still carrying things in your heart that mean you really.
Okay.
So I think you have to forgive someone fully. And that's not an easy thing, especially when there's layers in there that sometimes forgiveness, you can even mean it in your heart, but it doesn't necessarily make trauma go away. So there's just a lot of layers to it, I think.
When I hear forgiveness, I think of like that saying where it's like, there's two sayings. I haven't heard the second one until recently, but it was like when I was growing up, it was like forgive and forget, like forgive them and then forget about it, like move on. And then recently, like the past few years, I've been hearing like forgive but don't forget, like don't forget about what they did, but like forgive them so you can move on. And I don't really know which one I agree with because they're kind of like the opposite of each other. So I've been thinking about that. Like I don't know which one I particularly like think is right for me, but those are the two things I think of.
Well, so what would be the purpose in forgiving but not forgetting from your perspective?
I think it's just like forgive them for what they did so that you can move on for you. To me, forgiving isn't for them. It's not for the other person. Like you're not forgiving so that they can feel better. It's like it's for yourself so that you can feel better and you can move on without having like that anger or like worry like about the topic. But don't forget, I think it's just like don't forget about what they did, because if they do it again, like you have to remember like, oh, they did this before, like it's not their first time, or like you can just remember so you know how to deal with it if it happens again in the future.
Rich, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, Lily, you're pretty astute there with your thinking. I agree with everything you've said. I think the forget part, so again, it's such a multi-layered thing. I think it depends on let's just, for lack of a better word, let's just say betrayal, right? So a betrayal requires forgiveness, and so I'll use that term, right? So it depends on the level of the betrayal, the harm that it caused, because we're all the sum total of all of our different events in life, that we've experienced. And so You do need to forgive. I think you're right on, Lily. Forgiveness is something you give yourself. It's not what you give to the other. Forgiving them releases the toxic anger and all those other emotions that don't serve you. Forgetting for me is you don't carry it in your everyday life, right? So you can't go through life constantly on guard that that person's going to betray you again, or someone else is going to do that same betrayal or whatever, that you can't be constantly. So you have to forget about it to a certain extent to be able to function in a healthy and way. But you can't forget. You have to recognize the red flags. You have to, be somewhat guarded to protect yourself. So that's what I take from that. It's just a couple layers added to what Lily said. But that's the benefit of, 30 something years.
Well, and I think there's different circumstances that allow us to forgive easier than others. And in this conversation, I'm particularly thinking about my experience in Asia and with the boss or manager and leader, whatever you want to call him, who really broke down my entire first postgraduate experience and made it, frankly, quite a hellish experience for me. Belittling me, abusing my work, publishing things in my name that weren't edited properly because I wasn't the one to actually finish it. And so it was this entire mess where it wasn't just my personal well-being, but it was also my career that he had been sacrificing for his own personal interests. And so in that moment, and even shortly thereafter, I felt pretty bitter and upset, and I felt like I could never forgive him for what he did. But then looking back on it now, it's like, I am so glad that he did that, because that set my life on a path that I know now that it needed to be on. I just didn't know it at the time. And so I've forgiven him, but I'm also very grateful for what he did. But I wonder what would have happened if I had just given up and come home and not started traveling or trying to make something more of the experience. If I had just gone, okay, fine, I give up and left back to the States, I don't know that I would have been able to forgive and move on so quickly, because there was nothing that came out of it that I felt like was a benefit. So I certainly feel like there are different circumstances where if something better comes along, it's easier to forgive than it is if nothing else changes and you're just resting with this tragic event in your life.
Are you grateful for what he did, or are you grateful for the learning you got from that experience? Because I think there's a distinction to be made there, right? I mean, I don't know that you can be grateful. I guess that's the word that kind of struck me when you said it. I was like, you're really grateful for what he did? Or are you grateful for the experience and your reaction to it?
I couldn't be grateful for the experience if he didn't do what he did. Like, I couldn't be grateful for the learning that came from it if he didn't do it, if that makes sense. So that's kind of where my mind is going with that, is that I'm grateful he did it because of what I learned. But I couldn't be grateful for what I learned if he had never, I mean, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I'm definitely grateful for what I learned. But I think had he not done it in the exact way that he did, I don't think I would have come out of there with as much knowledge or mental strength as I did.
That implies though that you needed the trauma for you to get to that level of awareness. It may have accelerated a path that you were already on. But I'm not here to judge. I just had never heard somebody say I'm grateful for the person that traumatized me. I've never heard it said quite that way. So it struck me. That's all.
I learned a lot of valuable lessons, and I think that forgiving him was the first step, but realizing that there was so much value for me in what he did under poor pretense that I don't know. And there's and we're getting into the weeds here, but there's the additional layer of I did have a very good relationship with him before. And so I feel grateful for him as a person simply because we did have that good relationship. So because I'm able to practice gratitude for what we did have at one point, and even a little bit of gratitude for the fact that things totally went south. I'm definitely grateful for the person I am today because of it. And so I think because I have that gratitude, it's easier for me to forgive him because I have something so much better from it.
But no, I get it. I just had never heard it put quite that way before, right?
I'm an odd duck.
Well, I think though, and we might be going down into the weeds, but I think though you should give yourself more credit, and I would view it as maybe being proud for how you responded rather than being grateful for what he did, right? But yeah. I'm not, again, I don't know, Lily, what do you think about what we're talking about when it comes to forgiveness? And
I understand what she's saying when she said that she is grateful for the knowledge that she got, but she couldn't have gotten it without him doing what he did. And I think what has made it easier for her to or for you to forgive him totally, because you're so you're grateful for it now, but I feel like in the moment you were so mad at him and you felt betrayed or hurt. But I think the fact that you've just given it some time and you've just you've taken so many steps back, you're the way I'm thinking of it, you're looking at the situation from the outside, you're just watching it all happen. So you're grateful for that, and I think that's what I'm.
So Lily, tell me about a time where you had to, and if you need to think about it for a minute, feel free, but I'm really curious to know how you practice forgiveness or how others have practiced forgiveness towards you. I think it's something that can look different between generations in some way.
Well, I haven't really had any big traumatic things happen to me where I've had to forgive someone, a huge thing. But I've gotten into some arguments or fights with some friends. We've been so close, and then something happened and we just got in this really big fight. And in the moment I was so mad, and I just couldn't believe that my best friend was fighting with me, and I was just so confused, and I was is this happening? I just couldn't even believe it. But looking back, that was 3 years ago. So looking back at it now, I literally cannot even imagine myself still being mad about that. It just seems so far away and such a different person. So I think I don't ever verbally forgive someone I forgive you, don't worry about it. I just kind of forgive them in my mind. I'm oh yeah, I'm over it, I'm fine with it, I'm cool. I learned from the experience, I had a great time being their friend, and I'm glad that it happened, but I've moved on. So I think I don't ever verbally forgive someone and express my feelings. I just kind of do it to myself, and I just confirm it with myself, my heart, my brain, and I forget about it.
Have you guys ever forgiven because you actually forgot? There were stupid arguments in high school and middle school that I know ended or kind of frazzled some friendships of mine. And I picture myself walking into my high school reunion and literally having no idea what the argument was even about. I know for a fact I had a falling out with my college roommate, and we actually talked about this at one point when I went to go see her. I was I remember we had this huge fight and we didn't talk for weeks. And I, honest to God, cannot remember what it was even about. And so we just kept moving forward. But I feel like that's such an odd form of forgiveness. And then it really speaks volumes to how important really was the issue anyway, if you're forgiving by forgetting entirely. So it's not even giving you the option to forgive because it's just not there anymore.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. That's happened to me before. Like the argument I was just talking about, I personally don't even remember what it was about. I don't even know why we were fighting. I just remember in the moment, I literally felt like my whole 8th grade career was ending, and I was so scared. I was like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm going to do. She's my only friend. I was like, oh my gosh. But now I have no feelings towards that situation. I literally cannot tell you one thing that fight was about. And it just goes to show that even though the emotions at the time are very real, and you are definitely valid in feeling those things because it's a big situation, you'll get over it eventually. It's not the end of the world, and you'll eventually forget.
Still connected? Sorry. Are you still connected with them?
Um, I had like a class with her last year, but we don't talk that much anymore. We don't really.
You know, it's funny that you talk about forgetting. You know, there's forgive and forget, and then there's forget. Is that forgiveness, right? I mean, but I remember, and I actually had this conversation with my parents when I was a young adult at the time, and you know, my mom told me how my dad would drive her crazy because they would have a disagreement or something, and you know, they tell you don't go to bed angry or whatever, um but my dad had this habit where you'd get into a disagreement with him and it would be very emotional, you know, a lot of shouting, or what have you, and then the next day my mom would get up and she would still be carrying that anger, like, we're not done, we didn't finish. And my dad would come downstairs and it would be like, hey, good morning, everybody. And he had like carried none of it to the next day, which then completely would frustrate my mother because, you know, I use an expression, it's like pinning jello to a tree, or it's like, why don't, you know, then you're like, well, okay, if we're going to finish this argument, I need the other person to be as upset as me, because, you know, and not for the sake of arguing, but for the sake of sorting things out. And a lot of disagreements in my house would fizzle out because, you know, you had this like amnesia, you know, but the thing that happened though was when you had a disagreement in the future, those past slights that didn't get fully resolved would come up. Not from my dad. I mean, when he forgot it, right? But you know, from someone who had the disagreement, and you'd be like, well, what about this other time? We never, and he'd be like, what are we bringing up past into the, you know, and so, in some ways that ability to forget from day to day or not carry that anger forward was, you know, somewhat, I think it was healthy in some ways, but in other ways it was somewhat insidious in that, you know, and I don't know that this falls under the forgiveness thing, but you know, you do have to be able to kind of intellectualize it, internalize it, sort it out, and then let it go, right? Otherwise you're going to carry it with you in some way, you know. So you talk about forgive and forget. That story just occurred to me.
Well, and I think I struggle to draw between, okay, I forgive you for this thing that you did. And then, I mean, I have a fantastic memory anyway, so forgetting is kind of more of and that's in general, it's more of a construct or an idea rather than an actual, okay, memory wiped. But then as soon as something similar happens again with the same person, it's like all of those other instances where they did the same exact thing come flooding back. And then my brain starts to go, well, how did you not learn from this the first time we had this conversation? And so for me, I don't know, maybe you can help me identify, I don't know whether that's me not actually forgiving or me being frustrated by the fact that it keeps happening with no apparent aspiration to change. What's like, how do you decide between whether I'm actively forgiving or I'm just getting frustrated because I remember that this has happened 20 other times? Is that allowed to frustrate? Is the 20th time allowed to frustrate me if I have truly forgiven them? I guess that's the question.
Well,
if someone keeps walking in your house and stomping on your toes every time they walk through the door and you keep forgiving them every single time, but nothing ever changes, you've got to be allowed to be upset about that, right? I mean, they're coming in your house and stomping on your toes.
Yeah, because at some point it becomes more than just the act of stomping on your toes, and it becomes an act of, okay, this is crossed over into a complete lack of respect for me as a person. It's not the act of the toe stomping. I'm used to that. As a matter of fact, I've stomped on my toes so many times, it really doesn't hurt anymore. I am pissed about the fact that you just choose to stomp on my toes, right? So I think it does kind of transform into a different transgression, and than the individual act. And again, like I said with the previous thing, sometimes you can forgive the individual act, and you can forgive the individual act several times, but at some point it becomes more than just, okay, what is it that makes you think that I'm someone who you can stomp on? And I'm going to stand up for myself and say, this is not how I will be treated in the relationship. And it becomes a relationship more than the act. I mean, I think there's something good about being able to, I forget from time to time. It's kind of like, I was going down a slightly different angle where it's like, if you got a cut on your arm and it still hasn't healed over, it's very sensitive in that area. And so if something happens near that wound, you're going to be protective. Then it scabs over, so it doesn't hurt as much, but you know that it's there. And if you hit the scab, it'll open. So that's a different kind. Then you get to a point where it's like, well, you still notice the scar every day. So it's still in your mind. Oh, I remember how I did that. Or, oh, that's there. And then at some point, the scar fades to a point where you forgot it was even there, right? And so, where are you in the stage of that process of how often do you notice that scar, But yeah, I mean, if someone comes into your house and 20 different times and stomps on your foot, you may even laugh about it the 15th time and go, man, you just keep doing this. This is just getting to be comical, right? And then you get to a point where it's like, okay, we've hit 20 times now, and this is just ridiculous. So you need to just move on. I laughed about it because I didn't know what else to do, but I think depending on the context and the scenario, I can see you, it's like the stages of grief, if you will, right? And Lily, to your point, I mean, you had your only friend and you felt betrayed. That's a whole part of growing up, is just the idea of what does betrayal feel like, or what does real hurt feel like, and I've had conversations with different ones of my kids when, the boyfriend and girlfriend that break up in junior high or in high school, and they're just absolutely destroyed. And it's like, oh my goodness, I'm never going to tell you that those emotions you're feeling right now aren't real, but I will tell you though that it gets better. And when you come out the other side of it, you'll be fine. It's kind of a delicate balance, because sometimes I think people want to say, oh, you get over it, you're fine, you're 13, come on, what do you think, you're going to marry them or whatever? And it totally invalidate, right? So I think part of the forgiveness and part of everything actually has to do with where you are in your own life experience, so.
What about self-forgiveness? What does that mean to you all? Maybe nothing. Never mind.
That's a thing?
I think so. I suppose, yeah. I mean, I forgave myself for eating way too much chocolate last night, but that's about as much as I practice it.
Lily, I heard you say something.
No, yeah, it's definitely a thing. I feel like it, and maybe not for everyone, because sometimes you don't have to forgive yourself if you don't feel like you've done something enough to like be forgived for. But some people, I don't know how to explain this, because I've never personally had this big thing where I'm like, oh, you need to forgive yourself. Like you need to, you just need to like stop feeling guilty about it. But some people, they definitely have these really big experiences where they feel like it's all their fault and they did something wrong and they hurt other people, and they're like, oh my gosh, like say you lied to like your friends and they find out and they're all mad at you, and you realize that you really hurt them and like you hurt their feelings, you may feel guilty about that, and you're like, I can't believe like I lied to them and I ruined like a huge friendship. Like that's like more about self-forgiveness. Like you have to just forgive yourself and move on, because if you keep, I don't know, if you keep dwelling on that and making yourself feel bad about it, you're never going to move on, and you're never going to accomplish everything that you want, because you're going to keep holding yourself back from the guilt. And so I think that self-forgiveness is just a whole nother thing. Like it's just so much harder to forgive yourself than it is to forgive other people.
Is it easier to forgive yourself if other people make it verbally known that they have forgiven you?
I think it helps. Yeah, I think having people being like, oh, like, I forgive you, don't worry about it, like, I'm over it, it's fine. That definitely helps, but at the same time, you can still have doubts about yourself, and you're like, okay, well, they're over it, but you still hurt them, like, you still lied to them, like, because you know how you're your own biggest critic, like, you are your number one hater, like, no matter what everyone says, like, you're still gonna have these doubts about yourself, and you're still gonna be like, okay, well, even though they forgive me, like, I still hurt them, and I still put them through that, so should I forgive myself? And I think self-forgiveness just takes a lot longer.
I love it. I'm going to make myself a t-shirt. I am my number one hater.
Yeah.
You tried, but I win. Rich, what do you think?
I think I'm more inclined to forgive myself in the scenario that Lily outlined, where, and you said, where people forgive me, or, you know, you move past something. I think I'm more inclined to forgive myself. I think where I struggle with self-forgiveness is when I don't live up to my own expectations of myself, and I have this perception of what I should have done, and I didn't do it, or I didn't live up to it, and the inner critic just beats me up. You know, I think that's where I struggle the most, is the cumulative effect of the inner critic for things where I've not achieved what I'm capable of achieving, or I made decisions that put others at risk, and didn't necessarily end up having. It's forgiving myself when I think I've fallen short of my own expectations. That's where it gets tricky, because that is when it all is inside this wonderful wonderland of our own brain. I do more battle inside my head than I do outside almost every day. So.
I'm trying to think about a time that I forgave myself in the absence of other people forgiving me. Maybe because either they weren't involved, it was just a me thing, or I'd have to sit and think about that for a minute. Because I'd love to reflect on how that felt and what that process looked like, but I can't remember beyond forgiving myself for overeating on dessert. I mean, and that's simply out of necessity, because if I beat myself up every time I did that, I'd probably be here all day. So,
Right. Right.
What about the moments in which you have one person forgiving the other, and that's made very clear, but the other person unwilling to not necessarily take responsibility, because that's not what forgiveness is about, but unwilling to acknowledge that there is a healing process going on. So particularly if it's between two specific people, where do you go if you forgive and attempt to heal and the other person just doesn't? Does that sever everything entirely? Are you able to kind of move forward from that? I mean, what does that look like?
Well, I think just like, there's conditional and unconditional love, I think there's conditional and unconditional forgiveness, right? I think true forgiveness is you don't need to even get caught up in what the other person thinks or what they've processed, or, when you think that your forgiveness is only one side of a two-sided coin, I think you're falling into a trap, because then you're in a situation where it's like, okay, well, we had two distinctly different views of what actually happened between us. Now I've forgiven you, and I think you should forgive me in the same way, in the same level. And if my forgiveness is meant to release you of your guilt, then I need you to forgive me in a way that's meant to relieve me of my guilt. And it doesn't, I mean, now you're into multi-dimensional layers of, okay, what was the first transgression? Did you forgive in the same way I did? Am I allowed to let go of my guilt the same way that I think I let you let go of your guilt? Now you're into, that's where divorces happen when you get into that calculus, right? I mean, I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned over 24 years of marriage is, if you're going to forgive, you need to fully forgive. And you cannot get caught up in that other mental gymnastics that I just kind of outlined. And I think then once you've forgiven, from that point forward, it's not about whether they've done the same. It's now you look at that relationship through a slightly different lens, as far as, okay, now I'm going to judge you on your actions from this point forward. But to some extent, it's always colored by the context of those previous events. I don't know. I'm probably just rambling.
Does forgiveness look different between generations, do you think? Or do you think as humans, we all kind of function with forgiveness in the same light, no matter what age? Lily, you're making a face.
I'm just thinking, because I don't really know what forgiveness looks like in other generations, because I haven't had too many situations where I've had to like forgive someone or they've had to forgive me, because generally I live a pretty normal, mundane life. I don't have a whole bunch of fights. But like with my siblings, like for example, like my siblings, if we get into a fight, we don't really verbally like forgive each other. Like we don't apologize and be like, oh, I forgive you. We kind of just forget about it and move on. We don't even talk about it. We could get in this huge fight where everyone is crying and screaming, and then an hour later we're just watching movies and just chilling. So I don't know if that's normal, if that's just my generation, but we don't really verbally forgive each other.
Is that because, Lily, the emotions of the moment made it very real, and it was definitely a disagreement, but yet it didn't cross a line where nobody ever feels that there was an intent to harm or there was a complete lack of respect? I mean, is it because it doesn't, siblings have arguments all the time, right? But is it because that you're able to separate out, okay, you're a pain in the butt that day, and you were a real jerk when it came to this thing here, but it's not like they were intentionally trying to do you harm? Or, I mean, is it because nothing's ever crossed that threshold so far?
No, I don't. I mean, I agree that sometimes siblings, like, we know we're not actually trying to hurt the other person. We're just frustrated and trying to get our point across, but it comes across as fighting. But I think there were some times where I could feel that my siblings were intentionally trying to hurt my feelings in the moment because they wanted me to feel as bad as they do, because I'm pretty sure I might have hurt their feelings or something like that. And in the moment, they're trying to hurt mine and trying to make me feel as bad as them or even worse. But then later on, like I cry a lot when I'm fighting. So I'll be crying, and then I'll be sitting in my room afterwards. And the more I just sit there by myself, I'm just like, well, it wasn't that big of a deal. Like, they hurt my feelings, yeah, but I hurt theirs, and then that's it. Like, we can try to hurt the other person, but at the same time, we know that the fight was equal. So
do you think, though, that because you don't verbalize the forgiveness, there's any risk of any kind of unresolved issues kind of coming up, or a lack of awareness of maybe someone feels like there's a pattern? I mean, because sometimes not talking about it as actually and thinking it's resolved itself, you may find yourself in a situation where you know, okay, this relationship isn't entirely functional. I'm you know, I live in the same house with you, right? So I'm not implying anything, but I do know that there's a danger of, you know, I use the word with you kids all the time about nurturing, right? I mean, you have to nurture that relationship. You can't just expect it to be there, right? And so sometimes, or I wonder if the idea that you never quite sort it out because it's maybe uncomfortable or whatever, it means it just kind of accumulates over time. Oh, I'm just thinking out loud.
Well, because
I
if I didn't know that I was unintentionally offending someone or making them feel bad, if I didn't know and they didn't bring that to my attention, then I probably am not likely to change my behavior. So there's certainly that addressing the issue helps resolve future conflict, because then it gives the person a chance to step back and go, oh, I didn't realize that's how I was coming across. Let me work on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think not addressing the forgiveness is kind of just a result of we don't want to be like mushy feelings, like, oh, like, I forgive you, I'm sorry, like, I love you. Like, we don't address it, but I think we all know, like we all know that we were forgiven and we're over it, because we're not very good at pretending that we're not mad. Because if this was my friends, I would definitely talk to them about it, and I'd be like, okay, like I didn't like when you did this, or I'm sorry for what I did. But with my siblings, it's just different, because I think we, like, when we get in a fight and we separate and go into our own rooms and just sit there and just think and then come back out, I think we all come to the same conclusion that it's not that big of a deal and we were overreacting. So there was no, like, our fights have never gotten so bad where I have felt the need to talk to them after and be like, okay, well, like, here's the things that you said that I didn't like it hurt my feelings. Like, we all come to the conclusion that we're over it and it's whatever.
Okay. I mean, as long as you feel like you're being your authentic self, right? Not to sound, you know, kind of corny or anything, but if you feel like you're being yourself, you don't feel like you're walking on eggshells, you don't feel like, you know, I don't want to have an uncomfortable exchange because this relationship needs to survive over time. I mean, you know, some of the nurturing of the relationship between siblings has to be the ability to work through, you know, those anytime when you do feel that way. So I would hope that, I'm glad to hear that it's never gotten to a point where you felt like anybody has done anything that you needed to follow up on, right? But I hope that you're as honest with your siblings, and because sometimes just keeping the peace doesn't necessarily make the relationship stronger, right? So I just give you that word of caution.
How does the phrase "I'm sorry" fit into everything?
Well,
The way I think of it, if you aren't truly sorry and you're not being 100% genuine, don't say it. Because apologizing just to clear your name or to make yourself look better in their eyes, I think that's just, it's just kind of like ruining the phrase, because I've had people apologize to me and I know they don't feel bad at all and they just want me to forgive them so they can move on and feel better about themselves. And if anything, it just makes the situation worse, because you can tell when someone's not being genuine with their apology, and it just pushes you over the edge, and you're just like, okay, well, like, clearly you don't care. But if you're being genuine, like, I think you should apologize, and I think you should let them know that you feel bad and you want to fix things, or you just want them to know that you are sorry and you want them to know that you care about their feelings. So I think if you're genuine, do it, but if not, just keep it to yourself.
I think there's 3 words that come to mind. There's "I'm sorry," there's "I apologize," and then there's "please forgive me," right? And I think each one of them has their own. I mean, I think I'm sorry is probably the most hollow, because Well, first off, I'm sorry can be said, as an accusation. I'm sorry you felt that way, but that's not my problem, right? So
I can't stand that one. Like, I'm sorry you feel offended by my words. Okay, helpful.
Yeah, right. But also too, I'm sorry is what you have a toddler say when they do something, and it's like, it turns into this get out of jail free card. I can act however I act as long as I say I'm sorry, right? Or if you knock somebody over in a crowded restaurant as you run by or something, and they fall down, I'm sorry, and it's like, then you keep running. It's like you're leaving a wake, right? I apologize, I think, acknowledges some ownership, and not only ownership of the action, but ownership of the impact it had on someone else. So it's like, I apologize for what happened. And I think, I'm sorry that, you can, when you're using those terms together, I think the I'm sorry has a little more meaning to it, right? Because you're covering it from a couple different ways. And then please forgive me, is a way where I ask your forgiveness. It acknowledges that this is something that it's the other person's choice to give it or not. And you're asking, I think you're even more fully acknowledging that, okay, this happened, I had a role in it, but you have complete control over whether you want to forgive me or not. And I'm asking or hoping you will, right? I hope you will forgive me. So I think those are the different kind of layers. I think I'm sorry doesn't necessarily do it for me, just because it's a throwaway term.
I think now that you put it in that context, I see that now. And at first when you said I'm sorry versus I apologize, I kind of didn't really see the difference, because in my mind, I'm sorry is an apology. So saying I apologize is essentially the same thing. But you're right. And in terms of the kind of the watering down of the phrase, kids can use it to get out of situations and just, now what do you say? I'm sorry. And then everything goes back to normal and it happens over and over again. So I see a little bit now. I'm still not quite convinced that I apologize can be necessarily more powerful than I'm sorry, only in the sense of the word of you don't typically hear it. But I see where you're going with it.
Well, and I just threw those terms together in a progression, but I think there's times when someone can go, I apologize, my gosh, or someone can go, I am so very sorry. It's not the vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
It's the heart and the meaning and the looking in the eye and the acknowledgement of one's own responsibility in the situation, right? So you could use whatever term you wanted. It's what's behind the sentence that really makes the difference.
When I'm sorry is certainly more watered down than others.
Oh yeah. Say you're sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, go play.
Or the Ohioan way of saying sorry is oop. You guys ever seen that internet meme of like, you're from, or maybe it's a Midwestern thing, it's not necessarily just Ohio, but I suddenly became hyper aware of every time, like if someone bumps into me, I go, oops, sorry, oop. It's just
my gosh, I do that all the time at work. Like I constantly am bumping into someone, I'm like, oop. Like,
and it's kind of become synonymous with sorry. It's like, oop, they know I'm sorry.
Right.
But you're right. I think sincerity is really key in this. And I also think that in forgiveness, sincerity is incredibly important. And being able to separate when you're forgiving someone because you think it's the right thing to do versus truly meaning and intentionally forgiving, and then being able to continue moving forward without dwelling on what happened. So I think sincerity is the underlying glue that sticks all of this together.
I think the trick of it though is, so if you think about it in the form of injury happens at different levels, right? So there's surface injury, then there's the next level, and you know, if you forgive someone up here and the pain went here, maybe 70% of the time you're going to be able to get through and survive that, right? And you're going to truly forget about it. But there's this, if any interaction happens where now you've been brought down into that deeper level of emotion, or a connection at the core of that relationship, or if that relationship, you want to take that relationship to a deeper level where you need it, you have to go as deep as the pain has ever gone, and you have to be in that, you have to feel that pain again at some level and give forgiveness in that moment for the forgiveness to really stay. And that's why I think you have situations where I thought I forgave you, but I guess I didn't. And it's because, to your point about, 90% of the time and 90% of our interactions go to this level, and I don't feel that injury anymore. But in this moment, in this very, very deep and personal moment, when we are talking at a level that we haven't in a long time, and I really dig deep, I guess maybe there's a part of me that hasn't forgiven you, and so I think at some levels, forgiveness is something that you can give in layers. And maybe that goes to the ability to forget, right? You could forgive somebody, and you can even be surprised that you didn't forget. And the reason is because something brought you to a level of that emotion again. And you're like, okay, I haven't been here for a bit. And yeah, I guess maybe I didn't forgive you. And so I've had that happen, over the years, where I thought I had forgiven someone, and then something triggered a reaction or hit a nerve or whatever. And then I was like, no, I guess maybe I didn't. And
Is it okay not to forgive someone if it doesn't, because again, forgiveness is a gift that you give yourself, right? But if it no longer has an impact on you, like I can think of a particular relationship that ended, that I never necessarily forgave their actions because I couldn't possibly empathize or even begin to understand where they were coming from, and felt personally attacked and felt like, in my mind, some level of forgiveness comes from an ability to understand where they're coming from. At least in my mind, I like to forgive by reflecting on their perspective and seeing, okay, I can see how maybe in this moment I misconstrued things or they misconstrued things and things just got jumbled, and I'm going to accept this as a learning opportunity and move forward. I never really forgave this person, but it also doesn't really haunt my everyday life. I don't feel like it's impacting me at all on a regular basis. And even looking back on it, it's like, well, that was a really dumb thing to happen. But I never necessarily forgave her. Do you think forgiveness is synonymous with being able to move forward? Or do you think that it's possible to not forgive and just let it go?
Well, it's funny that you're saying that, because I was thinking to myself, and I just did a quick search here. Is the expression forgive and forget, or is the expression forgive or forget? Because if you've truly forgiven, that means you've released, right? And if you've truly released, and then there's nothing to remember, or it becomes a part of, okay, I've stripped the emotion away from that, but I know that it happened, right? But in some instances, to your point, it's like, I don't need to forgive you. I've forgotten but that was like a blip on my screen, and I didn't carry that from one day I was upset for a couple days, but I've forgotten all about that. And so it was interesting, because I look here and it says, what does it mean to forgive and forget? Is it forgive or forget? Is it forgive? Even in here in a quick Google search, I see both forgive and forget and forgive or forget. And so, I think I think we all probably have things that have happened to us and we've just forgotten about them because they didn't, that either that person or that action, if we took on board everything that happened to us over our lives, I think would be a hot mess. You know, Lily, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree with what you said when you said when you forgive, you detach the emotion from the situation, because if you haven't forgiven yet, you still feel something towards it and you feel what you felt in that moment. But if you've forgiven already, like, you can look back at it and realize that you were upset or hurt, but in the moment thinking about it, you have no attachment to it and you're kind of just like, okay, like, yeah, but like, I've moved on. But then there's also being not mad about it, but you haven't forgiven them, and at some point you just forget that you haven't forgiven them, and then you think back on it and you're like, oh yeah, like, that sucks, like, I guess that did happen. And then you're like, okay, but I still don't forgive them, but I'm not going to let it torment me every day of my life. I'm not going to wake up with a vengeance. Like, I don't care about it that much. So I agree. Like, I agree that there's two different things that you can do. You can either forgive and detach yourself, or you can forget about it and look back and just be like, okay.
Well, I think that's what I just came to the conclusion of is, as I'm sitting here, it's like, if that person were to come back into my life and try to rekindle things, I could easily look at them and go, you know, I really haven't forgiven you yet. That really hurt. And that's what got me started down that path of like, is it necessary to forgive? It's not, but that's not something, again, that I think about every day, or a relationship that I bring up all the time. And so that's why it's kind of interesting to me, that difference between forgive and forget, or forgive or forget.
Well, and I think, you know, I think it's interesting that we're covering this topic. It's probably one of the few topics where just the sheer age difference has come into play, right? Lily, you mentioned that you probably have one real time in your life so far where you felt the need to figure out if you were going to forgive, forget, or what you were going to do. And Aaron, you've had some experiences, and some that you've even forgotten, or you couldn't remember what the disagreement was about. You know, and I've got a little more water under the bridge, you know, as the gray beard in the group. But you will have more situations in your life where people float in and out of your life in different ways, in different contexts. I mean, I have one example of a person that I knew in high school, and I don't know that they liked me, and I don't know that I liked them. But we got reconnected through something a number of years ago, and you know, we basically reconnected at a level that was above where we were before in high school. Never really had to discuss what went on in high school, but you know, I've got a newfound respect for her as a person, and you know, it's kind of a situation where, you know, if you'd told me in high school that I was going to have a friendship with this person, I would have probably not thought that I would have been, right? And again, some of it is you know, we're high school, we were young kids, you know, so why do we need to, you know, rehash it, or you just get to a point where it's like, okay, I kind of like this connection we have now, and we have a shared background, and we can remember certain events that happened, and we know we had to come. And in some ways, that's actually strengthened the relationship, is knowing that we had a shared past, even though we were on different paths and hung with different groups at the time. So you'll run into that more, Aaron, where you come across people and you'll have to make a decision, right? And in the moment, those emotions will either come up and pass a threshold that makes you feel like you either don't want anything to do with that person, or they'll find this middle threshold where you're like, well, yeah, but it's not worth bringing up now. Let's see how things go from here. or it's, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that's actually pretty funny looking back on it. And then you don't even really even think about it, right?
Oh my God, like I got into an argument. It was the biggest fight in my middle school career about boondoggle. You guys know what boondoggle is?
Mm-mm.
It's those, like, you made them at summer camp. It's the plasticky strings that you can, like, you kind of tie together into these long chains. It's called boondoggle here. We started a little boondoggle business, and then business partners went south, and everyone was in, I mean, it was turmoil. Like, everything was a disaster. And I just look back on that going, oh my Lord, we got into arguments about boondoggle. Like, that's so stupid. And some of those things, but like, as comical as those are to me now, I know that in some way they helped me grow back then. And
Sure.
so forgiveness in my mind is incredibly associated with growth, because whether you're forgiving yourself or you're forgiving someone else, you're recognizing that that is not the end of the world. And I think that's why people who forgive, whether outwardly or within themselves, are so much happier, because they're able to recognize that that was not the end all be all. And that doesn't have to sever a relationship or a goal, or, you know, and I think that that's my biggest takeaway from this entire conversation too, is that forgiveness is the gift that you give yourself, but it's not just to give you peace of mind. It's also to help you it's also meant to help you continue to grow and to continue learning without condition.
Yeah. I mean, you if you don't forgive, then you've somewhat at some level have yourself in a permanent state of victimhood. You know, and so forgiveness is important.
Lily, any closing thoughts?
I was just thinking about this. I think it's important to give yourself
Well, it's good
time.
because we have a podcast. We spent the last hour thinking about it, but
Yeah, no, I was thinking about it like while you were saying your closing thoughts, because we were talking about like how like everything happens and like you realize that it's not the end. But I think it's important to give yourself time to forgive. Like don't just push yourself to forgive because you want to move on and you want to get on with your life, because even though you want to, you might not still fully forgive the other person. So I think it's important to give yourself time and really know that you forgive them and you've moved on. So just don't rush it, because it's not going to help you. But yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
no, I think that's very astute as far as, and that goes to the comment about levels of forgiveness, right? I don't know why I get this analogy of oil and sand. You can scoop if you spill oil and sand, you can scoop some out and put some sand over the top of it, and at the surface it looks like it didn't have a spill, but there's still oil underneath. And if you really are going to remediate the issue, that's the term they use when they do soil, it's called soil remediation. You got to really go deep. But at some levels, maybe you can't do that in the moment and you can't do it all at once. And maybe you never have to do it again. But if you ever come back and you need to dig a hole, then that spot that's deeper than you've dug before, you could find, okay, there's still oil here, right? And so until you go and you really get rid of all of it, and that's why it's like, I think forgiveness can happen in stages. To your point, you don't have to rush yourself, but you can give some level of forgiveness. You're like, okay, I'm going to forgive you. We can live day to day, and you know, and we can see each other in the hallway. But if, you know, 3 years later, someone you start to strike up that friendship again, and you're like, okay, hold on, we're going down a path where I'm going to need to trust you again. And if I really am going to trust you again, we need to talk about this and really share how you impacted me or how whatever, you know. And so now you come back in, and now it's important enough for you to go do that second level of forgiveness because you've re-entered a level of friendship that requires some trust, right? I don't know.
And don't forget to forgive yourself.
Very
That's
good.
That's a whole different, we need another hour and a half on that topic alone.
This has been an XYZ Storytellers episode about forgiveness. Be sure to like, subscribe, and follow, and we'll come at you next week.
There you go.
Perfect.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.